I've been flipping houses in rural West Virginia for about 12 years, buying distressed properties at tax auctions and county sales and either fixing them up for resale or stripping them for the materials, which in these mountains often means hand-hewn chestnut beams and old-growth hardwood flooring and stone that's worth more removed and sold than left in place as part of a structure nobody wants to buy. It's not glamorous work. Most of what I purchase is already past saving. Buildings that have been empty for years or decades, roofs collapsed under the weight of snow that nobody was there to shovel, floors rotted through where the plumbing failed, and the water had its way with the wood. I've walked into houses where trees were growing through the living room, where the second floor had fallen into the first, where the only occupants were raccoons and the particular breed of wasp that builds paper nests in the corners of rooms that haven't heard a human voice in 20 years. You develop a tolerance for decay in this line of work. You learn to see past the ruin to the bones beneath, assessing whether the foundation is sound, whether the framing can be salvaged, and whether the property has enough value in its materials or its location to justify the investment. You stop being surprised by what you find in abandoned houses, because after a dozen years, you've found everything: the collections and the hoards and the personal effects and the intimate detritus of lives that ended or moved on and left their physical evidence behind for strangers to sort through. Or I thought I'd found everything until the house in Braxton County. I bought the property in March of 2021 at a county tax auction. The listing was minimal, the way these listings always are: a parcel number, an acreage, a legal description that located the property on a county road about 8 miles from Sutton. The house had been seized for unpaid taxes after the owner, a man named Harold Pritt, died in 2003 without heirs or a will. The property had sat in county custody since then, accruing fees and deteriorating, one of hundreds of parcels across rural West Virginia that fall into the gap between private ownership and public use, too expensive to maintain and too worthless to attract buyers. I got it for $4,000, which was essentially the accumulated tax debt plus the auction fee. I drove out on a Saturday morning to assess the property. The county road was paved but narrow, winding through a hollow along a creek that I later learned was a tributary of the Elk River. The driveway was on the left, marked by a mailbox that had rusted off its post and was lying in the ditch, the name Pritt still legible in faded adhesive letters. The driveway itself was gone, reclaimed by 18 years of unchecked growth, a quarter-mile corridor of saplings and briars and honeysuckle that had closed over the gravel like a wound healing. I'd brought a machete, which is standard equipment for this kind of work, and I spent 45 minutes cutting my way up the driveway toward the house, which I could glimpse through the canopy as a flash of white clapboard and a dark roofline. The house was a small two-story frame structure, probably built in the 1940s based on the construction style, sitting on a poured concrete foundation in a clearing that the forest was steadily shrinking from all sides. White clapboard siding, green asphalt shingle roof, a covered front porch with turn posts, and a simple railing. The exterior paint was peeling, but the wood beneath was mostly sound. The roof was sagging in the middle but intact, with no visible holes. The windows were clouded but unbroken. For a house that had been abandoned for at least 18 years longer, as I would soon discover, it was in remarkably good condition, the kind of preservation that happens when the construction is decent and the roof doesn't fail, and the house sits in a hollow where the temperature and humidity conspire to slow the decay that would destroy a lesser structure. I stepped onto the porch. The boards gave slightly but held. The front door was unlocked, which wasn't unusual. Rural houses in West Virginia often aren't locked even when they're occupied, and I pushed it open and stepped inside and stopped. The house was furnished, fully, completely furnished, every room equipped with the belongings of a person who was living there, not someone who was leaving or packing up or transitioning out, but someone who was in the middle of the daily business of life and had simply stopped. The living room held a couch, an armchair, and a television set, the old tube kind, with a TV guide on the arm of the chair open to a page of listings. A pair of slippers sat on the floor beside the chair, positioned the way slippers sit when someone has stepped out of them. A cup of something sat on the end table, the liquid long since evaporated to a dark ring at the bottom. I walked into the kitchen and felt the first real pulse of unease that would deepen over the next hour into something I still haven't fully processed. The kitchen table was set for one. A plate sat at the single place setting, and on the plate were the desiccated remains of a meal. I couldn't identify what it had been. Time and desiccation had reduced the food to brown, shrunken shapes that held their general form, but had lost all color and moisture, mummified by the dry air of a house that had been sealed for years. A fork lay across the plate at an angle, set down between bites, the way you rest a fork when you're pausing to drink or to adjust your napkin or to listen to something. A glass stood beside the plate with a tied line of residue marking where the liquid had been. A napkin, cloth, was folded beside the plate, and it was half unfolded, as if someone had been in the process of placing it in their lap when they'd stopped. The stove had a pot on it, cast iron, the heavy kind that people in these mountains have used for generations. The pot was empty, the interior scorched black from whatever had been in it, cooking down to nothing, and then continuing to heat until the burner was turned off or the fuel ran out. The stove was electric. The power was off. The burner had been on when the power stopped, whenever that was. The calendar on the wall beside the refrigerator was turned to September 1987. I stood in that kitchen and looked at the calendar and did the math. Harold Pritt had died in 2003, which was when the county had taken the property. But the calendar said September 1987, which meant the house had been frozen in that month for 16 years before Harold officially died. 16 years of a meal sitting on a plate, a fork resting between bites, a pot scorching on a stove, a glass holding the ghost of whatever Harold had been drinking on a September evening in 1987, when he set down his fork and stood up from the table and left. Or didn't leave. Or something happened that interrupted the simple mechanics of eating dinner and arrested the entire house in the moment of interruption. I walked through every room. Each one confirmed the same narrative. The living room, with its slippers and its TV guide, open to September 14 to 20, 1987. The bathroom, where a bath had been drawn and never used, the water evaporating over the years and leaving a mineral ring in the tub that marked the high water line like a geological stratum. A towel hung over the shower rod. A bar of soap sat in the dish, cracked and faded but still holding its shape. A razor and a can of shaving cream stood on the shelf above the sink, arranged with the particular neatness of a man who lived alone and kept his space orderly. The upstairs bedroom was the worst, not because of anything dramatic, but because of the intimacy of what it showed. The bed was a double, and it was made on the right side, the covers pulled tight and smooth, the pillow fluffed, the careful work of someone who made their bed every morning as a matter of habit. The left side was slept in. The sheets were pulled back at an angle, the pillow bore the impression of a head, and the bedding had the rumpled contour of a body that had been lying there and had gotten up. The nightstand on the slept-in side held reading glasses, a glass of water that had long since evaporated, and a paperback novel with a bookmark at page 143. Harold Pritt had gone to bed one night in September of 1987. He'd read to page 143 of his book. He'd taken off his glasses and placed them on the nightstand, set the book down, turned off the lamp, and gone to sleep. And then he'd gotten up at some point and gone downstairs, and the bed had never been made, and the book had never been finished, and the glasses had never been put on again. I checked the county records when I got home. Harold Pritt's death certificate listed the date of death as June 2003, the cause of death as undetermined, and the body discovered by a county utilities worker checking a water meter. The death certificate noted that the body was found on the property, but didn't specify where. The coroner's report, which I obtained through a public records request, stated that the remains were skeletal, consistent with a death occurring years before discovery, and that the exact date of death could not be determined. Estimated time of death, unknown. The report noted that the condition of the house suggested the deceased had been absent from the residence for an extended period before death. Absent from the residence. The house with the dinner on the table and the bath drawn and the bed slept in, and the calendar turned to September 1987. Harold had been absent from it for 16 years before his body was found on the property in 2003. He'd gotten up from his dinner and walked away from his life and lived somewhere on that property, or near it, or in the woods around it, for 16 years, without going back inside, without finishing his meal, without making his bed, without turning the page of his book. Where was he? For 16 years, where did he sleep? What did he eat? Where did he go when the winters came and the temperature dropped? and the hollow filled with snow. He was found on the property, which means he never left. He was within a quarter-mile of a house that held his dinner and his slippers and his reading glasses and everything else a person needs for a normal life. And for 16 years, he didn't go back inside. I've renovated the house. It's been gutted and rebuilt and sold to a couple from Charleston who use it as a weekend place. The kitchen has new cabinets and a new floor, and no memory of the meal that sat on its table for 34 years. The bedroom has new paint and new furniture, and the impression in the pillow is gone. But I kept the calendar, September 1987. It's in my office, on the wall, and I look at it sometimes and think about Harold Pritt getting up from his dinner on a September evening and walking out of his house and not coming back for 16 years, living somewhere in the hollow or the woods or wherever he went, close enough to come home and choosing not to, every day for 16 years, the house holding his place at the table, the fork resting between bites, the pot scorching on the stove, everything waiting for him to sit back down and finish his meal. And I wonder what he saw, what he heard, what happened between one bite and the next that made a man walk away from everything and spend 16 years in the woods rather than go back inside. What was in that house on that September evening that was worse than 16 years of whatever he endured outside it? I don't know. The house doesn't say. The calendar shows September, and the fork rests on the plate, and page 143 will never be turned. And whatever Harold Pritt was running from is either gone or patient, waiting in a renovated house with new cabinets and new paint for someone else to sit down at the table and start a meal they won't finish. Our grandmother died in February of 2019, 3 weeks after her 91st birthday, in the house where she'd lived for 67 years. The house was in Letcher County, Kentucky, up a hollow off Route 7, a 4-room structure that my great-grandfather had built in the 1920s on a hillside above a creek that ran year-round except in the driest weeks of August. The construction was typical for the era and the region: rough sawn lumber on a stone foundation, a tin roof that had been replaced twice in the house's lifetime, a covered porch on the front, and a lean-to kitchen addition on the back that my grandfather had built in the 1950s when indoor plumbing arrived in the hollow. The house was small and plain and had never been anything more than what it was: a shelter for a family that lived close to the ground and didn't need much space to do it. Grandmother had lived alone in that house for 30 years after our grandfather died in 1989. She was the kind of woman that the mountains produced in her generation: tough and private and self-sufficient in ways that modern people find either admirable or concerning, depending on their perspective. She heated with wood, cooked on a propane stove, kept a garden that fed her through the summer, and a cellar of canned goods that fed her through the winter. She drove her truck to town once a week for what she couldn't grow or make. She went to church on Sunday. She didn't have a television until my sister bought her one in 2005, and I'm not sure she ever turned it on. She lived in that house the way a stone sits in a creek bed, settled and unmoved by the current of the world flowing around her. My sister Rachel and I were her only family by the time she died. Our mother, her daughter, had passed in 2011, and our father had left the picture long before that. We were the ones named in the will, which was simple: the house and the property to be divided equally between us, everything inside to be sorted and disposed of at our discretion. We drove down from Lexington on a Saturday in March, planning to spend the weekend going through the house, deciding what to keep, what to donate, and what to throw away. The house was exactly as she'd left it, which is to say it was exactly as it had been for as long as I could remember. Clean, orderly. The surfaces were wiped down, and the floors swept with the particular attention of a woman who believed that cleanliness was a form of respect for the life you'd been given. The dishes were washed and put away. The bed was made. The wood stove was cold but clean. The ash pan empty. The hearth swept. Grandmother had died in the hospital after a fall. Not in the house, but the house showed no evidence of her absence. It looked like she'd stepped out to check the garden and would be back in a minute. We started in the living room and the kitchen, which were the easiest rooms, the public spaces where the belongings were functional rather than personal: furniture, dishes, cookware, linens. We boxed what was worth donating and bagged what wasn't, and worked our way through the house with the methodical efficiency of people who needed the activity to process the loss. By Saturday evening, we'd cleared the front rooms and moved to the bedrooms. There were two: grandmother's bedroom, which was the larger of the two and faced the front of the house, and the back bedroom, which had been our mother's room as a child and had served various purposes over the decades, a sewing room, a storage room, and in its later years, a room that grandmother kept closed and didn't seem to use for anything at all. The door was always shut when we visited. If we asked about it, she'd say it was full of things she hadn't gotten around to sorting, which was plausible enough that we never pressed. The back bedroom was small, maybe 10 by 12, with one window that looked out at the hillside behind the house. The walls were covered in wallpaper, a floral pattern that I recognized from my childhood, pink and yellow flowers on a cream background, the kind of wallpaper that was popular in the 1970s, and that grandmother had probably hung sometime in that decade. The paper was yellowed with age and peeling at the seams, the paste giving up after 50 years of holding. A single bed with a bare mattress sat against one wall, a dresser with empty drawers against another, a closet with a few wire hangers. The room had been stripped of personal items, cleaned, and closed. Its function as a living space ended at some point that we couldn't determine. Rachel decided to strip the wallpaper. She wanted to see the condition of the plaster beneath, wanted to know whether the walls were sound enough to justify renovating the house, or whether the structure was too far gone to save. She started in the corner by the window, working a putty knife under the edge of the wallpaper and peeling it back in long strips that came away from the wall with the dry, papery sound of old adhesive releasing. She got about 3 feet of wallpaper off the wall before she stopped and called my name. Not loudly, not with alarm, but with a tone that I recognized as the particular frequency of someone who has seen something they need another person to confirm, who needs a witness before they trust what their own eyes are telling them. I walked into the room and looked at the exposed plaster where Rachel had stripped the wallpaper, and I understood why she'd called me. The wall was covered in writing. Not pencil, not pen, not marker, paint. Small, dense handwriting painted directly onto the plaster surface with what appeared to be house paint applied with a very fine brush, the kind of detail brush you'd use for trim work or for painting letters on a mailbox. The writing was dark brown or black, hard to tell against the off-white plaster, and it covered every inch of the exposed surface in neat horizontal rows, floor to ceiling, edge to edge, the letters maybe a 1/4 inch tall, packed so tightly that from a distance the wall looked textured rather than written on. I moved closer and tried to read it. The handwriting was consistent and deliberate, each letter formed with care, but the size made it difficult to decipher without magnification. I pulled out my phone and used the camera to zoom in on a section at eye level, and what I saw were names. Human names, first and last, written one after another with small spaces between them. Hundreds of names filling the wall in rows that ran from left to right and top to bottom like lines in a book. Rachel kept stripping wallpaper. The names continued. Every inch of plaster that the wallpaper had covered was painted with names. The same small, L-dense handwriting, the same dark paint, the same meticulous rows. We stripped all 4 walls. Same thing. We looked at the ceiling. Same thing. The names painted in rows across the plaster above our heads, the painter presumably standing on a chair or a ladder to reach the furthest points, covering every surface with the same obsessive thoroughness. We counted. Rachel started at one wall, and I started at another, and we counted names for over an hour, working section by section, keeping tallies on our phones. We reached 2,000 and stopped, not because the names had ended, but because we had, the scale of what we were looking at exceeding our ability to process it methodically. There were more than 2,000 names painted on the walls and ceiling of that back bedroom, each one written individually, each one legible under magnification, each one a person's name, a first name and a surname, sometimes with a middle initial. Some of the names I recognized: Combs, Caudle, Adams, Baker, the old families of Letcher County whose names appear on mailboxes and gravestones and in the county records that go back to the original land grants. I found names that matched headstones in the cemetery at the church, where my grandmother had worshipped for 60 years. I found names that appeared in census records from the 1800s, people who had lived and died in this hollow, and the surrounding hollows generations before our grandmother was born. And I found names I couldn't trace at all. Names that appeared in no record I could find, no census, no cemetery, no church register, no county document. Names that belonged to people who either left no trace of their existence or who existed in a form that public records don't capture. Some of them felt old, the kind of names that were common in Appalachia in the 18th and 19th centuries. names that had fallen out of use by the time anyone was keeping systematic records of who lived in these hollows. The handwriting was consistent throughout, the same hand on every wall and the ceiling. One person had done this, sitting or standing in this room, painting names in rows with a fine brush, working with the focused patience of someone performing a task that was important enough to justify what must have been weeks or months of labor. The paint was the same color and consistency on every surface, suggesting it had been done in a single campaign rather than over time. Grandmother had hung wallpaper over it, deliberately, carefully, the way she did everything, with the precision and thoroughness that she applied to every task in her life. She had covered the names with pink and yellow flowers and closed the door and lived in the house for the remaining decades of her life, without mentioning to anyone that the back bedroom was a manuscript, that its walls held the names of over 2,000 people painted in a handwriting that I couldn't identify as hers or my grandfather's or anyone else's. I asked the few people in the hollow who'd known our grandmother well enough to visit her house. None of them had ever been in the back bedroom. None of them knew about the writing. The woman at the church who'd been grandmother's closest friend for 40 years told me that grandmother had never mentioned the room and that she'd always assumed it was storage, the way grandmother described it. I checked the handwriting against samples of grandmother's writing, her letters, her grocery lists, and the annotations in her Bible. It didn't match. The wall writing was smaller, more precise, more consistent than grandmother's script, which was the practical, slightly uneven hand of a woman who wrote as a tool rather than an art. Whoever painted those names was a different person, someone with a steadier hand and a different relationship with the act of writing. My great-grandfather built the house in the 1920s. The wallpaper was hung in the 1970s. Somewhere in that 50-year window, someone sat in the back bedroom and painted over 2,000 names on the walls and ceiling. My grandmother knew about it, and she covered it with wallpaper, and she closed the door, and she never spoke of it. I don't know who wrote the names. I don't know why. I don't know whether the names represent the living or the dead or some category that encompasses both. I don't know whether the act of writing them was memorial, inventory, or warning, or something else entirely. Some function that I can't guess at because it belongs to a tradition or a compulsion that I have no framework for understanding. We sold the house. The new owners gutted it, and the plaster walls with their 2,000 names were torn out and hauled to the county dump and buried under the accumulating weight of everything else that Letcher County discards. But I photographed every wall before it was destroyed. Every name, captured in high resolution on my phone, is stored on a hard drive in my apartment in Lexington. 2,000 and some names, painted in neat rows by a hand that wasn't my grandmother's, on walls that she chose to cover rather than explain. Sometimes I scroll through the photographs and read the names and wonder who they were. And sometimes, late at night, I find a new name that I haven't checked before, and I search for it in the records and find nothing. No trace of a person by that name in any database or archive, and I wonder if the name hasn't been recorded yet. If the list on those walls wasn't a record of the past, but a catalog of the future, written by someone who could see what was coming, who sat in a small room in a house in a hollow in eastern Kentucky and painted the names of everyone who would live and die in these mountains, one after another, in neat rows, with the patience of someone who had a very long list and all the time in the world. And I wonder if my name is on those walls, and my sister's, and the names of the people who bought the house and the workers who tore out the plaster and everyone else who passed through that hollow and that house and that room where the names were written and covered and forgotten. I don't look anymore. I close the folder on my hard drive and I don't open it because looking at those names started to feel less like research and more like reading something I wasn't supposed to read. A document that was covered for a reason by a woman who understood that some things are meant to be hidden and that wallpaper, like silence, is a form of protection. And grandmother kept the door closed. For 30 years, she kept the door closed and the wallpaper up and the names hidden, and she never told anyone what was behind the flowers. I think she was right. I think some walls should stay covered, and I think the names on those walls are still being written somewhere by someone in a room that I'll never find and wouldn't enter if I could. I bought the farmhouse in the fall of 2018 at an estate auction that nobody seemed particularly interested in attending. The property had been in the same family for 4 generations. The last owner, a woman named Edith Calhoun, who'd been moved to an assisted living facility in Harrisonburg in 2007 when her health declined past the point where living alone in a house 6 miles from the nearest neighbor was tenable. She died there in 2015, and the estate had spent 3 years working through the legal mechanics of selling a property that nobody in the family wanted, and that the rural real estate market in the Shenandoah Valley didn't particularly need. By the time it went to auction, it had been vacant for 11 years, and the starting bid reflected the market's indifference. I paid $62,000 for a house, a barn, and 18 acres. The house was a stone and timber structure dating to the 1850s, pre-Civil War, built by people who understood that the valley's winters required walls thick enough to hold heat, and summers required rooms tall enough to let it rise. The walls were limestone, 2 feet thick at the base, tapering to 18 inches at the second floor. The framing was hand-hewn chestnut, the beams showing the broad axe marks of a craftsman who had shaped each timber by hand from trees that had been growing when the Revolution was fought. The roof was standing seam tin, replaced sometime in the 1960s based on the fasteners, and it had held. The house was sound. Not comfortable, not livable in its current state, but sound in the way that stone and chestnut are sound, the materials outlasting the people who shaped them by centuries. I moved in while doing the renovation, which is the only way I could afford the work. I'm a carpenter by trade, which meant I could do most of the labor myself, and living in the house while I did it saved me the cost of renting somewhere else. I set up in the 2 upstairs bedrooms, which were in better condition than the ground floor, the plaster intact and the floors solid. I ran an extension cord from the temporary electrical panel to power a few lamps and a space heater, and I used a camp stove and a mini fridge in the upstairs hallway for cooking. The ground floor was the project zone, and I worked through it room by room, starting with the parlor and the dining room, rewiring, replumbing, replacing plaster, and refinishing floors. The kitchen was the last room on my list, partly because it needed the most work, and partly because it was the most intact. Where the other ground floor rooms had been stripped of their original features by various modernization attempts over the decades, the kitchen had been left largely alone. It was big, maybe 20 by 16, with a massive stone fireplace on the north wall that had originally been the cooking hearth, a cast-iron wood stove from the early 1900s that sat in front of the fireplace on a stone pad, open shelving along the east wall, a dry sink that had been retrofitted with plumbing sometime in the 1950s, and a plank table in the center of the room with 6 mismatched chairs around it. The floor was wide plank, probably original, worn into shallow valleys along the paths between the stove, table, and sink, the wood polished by 170 years of feet following the same routes through the room. I left the kitchen untouched for my first 3 months in the house. I didn't cook in it, didn't store food in it, didn't use it for anything except as a corridor between the back door and the rest of the house. I kept the cabinet doors closed, the drawers shut, the chairs pushed in, the wood stove damper sealed, the room in the neutral state of a space that was waiting for renovation. The first change I noticed was the cabinet door. I came downstairs on a November morning, maybe 3 weeks after I'd moved in, and the cabinet above the dry sink was open. Not fallen open, not swung open by gravity or a faulty latch. Open, pulled open the way you open a cabinet when you're reaching for something on the shelf inside. The door at about a 45-degree angle, stable, held there by the friction of hinges that were old but functional. I closed it. I checked the latch, which was a simple turn catch that worked fine. I turned the catch and went about my day, and didn't think about it further, because a single open cabinet in an old house has 100 explanations, and none of them require anything more sinister than wood movement or a defective latch or the simple mechanical reality of old hardware in changing temperatures. The next morning the cabinet was open again. Same door, same angle, and the drawer beside the sink was pulled out about 2 inches. I closed both and checked both latches and went to work in the parlor. The following morning, the cabinet was open, the drawer was out, and the damper on the wood stove had been adjusted from closed to half open. I hadn't touched the wood stove. I hadn't been in the kitchen the previous evening, except to walk through to the back door. I started paying attention. Each morning, I'd come downstairs and survey the kitchen and note what had changed. The changes were consistent and specific. The cabinet above the sink was always open. The drawer beside the sink was always pulled out 2 inches. The wood stove damper was always adjusted, and 2 of the chairs at the table, the ones at the head and at the right-hand side, were always pulled out from the table at angles that suggested occupancy, as if two people had been sitting there and had pushed their chairs back when they stood up. Always the same two chairs, always the same angles. I tried locking the changes down. I wired the cabinet shut with a twist tie. In the morning, the twist tie was untwisted and the cabinet was open. I turned the chairs upside down on the table, the way restaurants do at closing. In the morning, the two chairs were right side up on the floor, pulled out at their usual angles, and the other four remained inverted on the table exactly as I'd left them. Whatever was moving, the chairs knew which two it wanted and didn't touch the rest. I set up a camera. A battery-powered trail camera, the same type I'd used for wildlife monitoring, was mounted on a shelf in the corner of the kitchen with a clear view of the table, the stove, the sink, and the cabinets. I set it to take a photograph every 3 seconds, all night, from the time I went upstairs until the time I came down in the morning. The first night's card contained over 7,000 images. I loaded them onto my laptop and scrolled through them with the patient attention of a man who needed an answer. The images were time-stamped and sequential, with 3-second intervals from 10 p.m. to 7 a.m. For the first 4 hours, nothing changed. The kitchen sat in the gray-green palette of the infrared sensor, everything in its place. Cabinets closed, chairs pushed in, damper sealed. Frame after frame of a still, empty kitchen. At 2:14 a.m., the cabinet was open. Not opening, not in the process of moving. Closed in one frame, open in the next. 3 seconds between images. And somewhere in those 3 seconds, the cabinet door had moved from closed to its 45-degree position without any visible cause. No hand, no figure, no shadow, no blur of motion. The door was simply closed and then opened, as if the state had changed without the transition, as if the cabinet existed in two conditions and had switched from one to the other between frames. I went through the rest of the images with the focus of someone who needed to understand what they were looking at. At 2:14, the cabinet opened. At 2:17, the drawer pulled out. At 2:23, the damper shifted. At 2:31, the first chair moved, the one at the head of the table, pulling back from the table to its usual angle. At 2:34, the second chair moved. Every change occurred between frames, in the 3-second gaps between photographs, with no visible mechanism and no visible presence. The kitchen was performing its changes in the dark, adjusting itself into the configuration that I found every morning, and it was doing it with a precision that suggested not randomness but sequence, a specific order of operations that began with the cabinet and ended with the chairs. The same order every night, the routine of a person entering a kitchen and opening a cabinet and pulling out a drawer and adjusting a stove and sitting down at a table. I increased the camera's capture rate, 1 frame per second. The changes still occurred between frames. I tried the video, continuous recording, 30 frames per second. The video showed the same thing the photographs showed, an empty kitchen in which objects changed position between frames with no visible cause, no transitional state, no motion, closed to open, in to out, sealed to adjusted. The changes happened in the gaps between what the camera could capture, in intervals too short for 30 frames per second to catch, which meant they were occurring in less than 1/30th of a second, faster than the eye could see, faster than any physical object should be able to move without producing blur or sound or vibration. I lived with it. That's the part people don't understand when I tell this story, which I've done maybe 4 times, carefully, to people I trust. They ask why I didn't leave. The answer is simple. It wasn't threatening. Nothing about the kitchen's nightly routine suggested hostility or danger or even awareness of my presence. The changes were domestic, mundane. The same cabinet that a cook would open to reach for flour or salt. The same drawer that held utensils. The same damper adjustment that you'd make when starting a fire in the stove. The same chairs where a husband and wife might sit for a quiet cup of coffee before the rest of the household woke. Whatever was using my kitchen at night was performing the routines of daily life, the repetitive actions that become so embedded in a person's identity that they continue beyond the boundary that normally ends all routines. I renovated the kitchen in the spring. I replaced the cabinets, the counters, and the sink. I removed the wood stove and sealed the fireplace. I refinished the floor, painted the walls, and installed new lighting. I kept the table because it was original to the house and beautiful, but I replaced the chairs with new ones from a furniture store in Staunton. The cabinet opening stopped. The drawer pulling stopped. The damper adjustment stopped, obviously, because the wood stove was gone. But the chairs still move. Every morning, two of the new chairs, the ones in the same positions at the table, head and right side, are pulled out at angles that I've stopped trying to prevent. Whatever was used in that kitchen learned where the new chairs are. Whatever sat at that table for 170 years of mornings is still sitting there, adjusting to the new furniture the way it adjusted to every change the house has undergone since the 1850s, pulling up a chair and taking a seat at a table that has been the center of this kitchen since before the Civil War. I eat breakfast at that table every morning. I sit in the chair on the left side, the one that never moves, and across from me, at the head of the table, a chair is pulled out at an angle, and beside it, at the right side, another chair is pulled out, and I eat my eggs and drink my coffee in the company of two people I've never seen and will never see, who use this kitchen the way they've always used it, in the hours before dawn, in the gaps between what cameras can capture, performing the rituals of a household that ended decades ago, and that continues every night in a kitchen that remembers its purpose, even when the people who gave it that purpose are gone. I don't fight it anymore. I leave the two chairs pulled out when I go to bed, the way you'd set a place at the table for someone you're expecting. It feels like the right thing to do. It feels like the least I can do for the people who built this kitchen and cooked in it, and sat at this table and wore the valleys in the floor, and hung the cabinets and built the stove and lived here long enough that the house absorbed their routines and performs them still, every night, in the dark, in the kitchen that was theirs before it was mine, and that will be theirs long after I'm gone. I've been inspecting houses in rural western North Carolina for 15 years, which is long enough to have crawled through every kind of space that residential construction produces, from the immaculate crawl spaces of new builds to the terrifying basements of pre-Civil War structures, where the foundation walls are dry stacked stone and the floor joists are logs that still have bark on them, and the air smells like 2 centuries of damp earth and the slow decomposition of whatever died down there and was never removed. The work requires a particular temperament, a comfort with tight spaces and dark places, and the general condition of neglect that characterizes most of the structures I'm hired to evaluate. I've found dead animals in walls. I've found live snakes in attics. I've found collections of things that people hid in their houses and forgot about or chose not to retrieve. Bottles and boxes, and once a leather satchel full of Confederate currency that had been tucked between the joists of a farmhouse that had been standing since 1858. Nothing surprises me anymore in terms of what a house can contain, or that's what I believed until the house in Madison County. The property was a large frame structure on 12 acres at the end of a dirt road outside Mars Hill, built in the 1890s by a family whose name I recognize from the local history books, one of the old mountain families that had been in Madison County since before the Civil War. The house was 5 bedrooms, 2 stories, with a wraparound porch and a standing seam metal roof, and the generous proportions that wealthy mountain families built with in that era, high ceilings and wide hallways, and rooms large enough to hold the furniture of people who had things. It had been vacant for 18 months following the death of the last owner, a woman in her 90s whose family had put the property up for sale through an estate attorney in Asheville. The attorney met me at the property on a Tuesday morning in September with a ring of keys and a folder of documents, and the particular efficiency of someone who was managing one of many properties and didn't have time for small talk. He walked me through the house quickly, pointing out the features that the listing highlighted and the issues that the seller's disclosure required him to mention. The house was in decent condition for its age, the structure sound, the roof tight, and the systems outdated but functional, standard inspection territory. As we were finishing the walkthrough on the second floor, he mentioned, almost as an aside, that one of the bedrooms couldn't be opened. It was at the end of the upstairs hallway, the last door on the left, and he'd tried every key on the ring without success. The family had confirmed that the room had been locked for as long as anyone could remember. The deceased owner's daughter, who was in her 70s, said she'd never been inside it. Her mother had told her it was locked when she was a child, and it was still locked when her mother died. At least 40 years, possibly much longer. I walked to the door and examined it. It was solid oak, original to the house, hung on heavy iron hinges, with a mortise lock set into the edge of the door at about waist height. The lock was a standard Victorian-era mortise with a keyhole that accepted a skeleton key, the kind you can usually open with a set of picks or a universal key if the original is lost. I tried my set of skeleton keys, which I carry for exactly this kind of situation in old houses. None of them worked. The lock was engaged, and it wasn't a matter of finding the right key shape. The bolt was thrown fully into the strike plate, solid, immovable. I knelt and looked through the keyhole. Nothing. The room beyond was dark, the keyhole showing only a small circle of blackness that gave no information about what the room contained. I pressed my ear to the door and listened. Nothing. The stillness of a closed room, the particular dead silence of a space that has been sealed and is holding its air. I noted it in my report as an inaccessible area, which is the professional designation for any space that I can't enter and therefore can't evaluate. It's not uncommon in old houses. Locked rooms, sealed crawl spaces, and attic areas blocked by insulation or structural modifications. You note it, you document the limitation, you move on. The buyers will deal with it on their end. The buyers were a young couple from Asheville, early 30s, the kind of people who buy old mountain houses with renovation plans and more enthusiasm than experience. They purchased the property and moved in, about 3 weeks after closing, and hired a locksmith to open the room. The locksmith called me. His name was Garrett, a man I'd worked with on several properties over the years, a quiet professional who'd been opening locks in Madison County for 2 decades. He called me on a Thursday evening, and his voice had a quality that I recognized not as fear, but as the particular carefulness of someone who has encountered something they don't fully understand and is choosing their words with more than usual precision. He told me he'd open the door. The lock, he said, was a high-quality Victorian mortise in good working condition, not corroded, not seized, not damaged. The bolt was fully engaged in the strike plate, thrown from the inside. He emphasized this. The lock could only be engaged from inside the room. There was no exterior keyhole mechanism that would allow someone to lock the door from the hallway. The lock was designed to be operated from within the room, by someone standing inside, turning the thumb turn on the interior face of the lock. Someone had been inside that room, had turned the lock, and had either stayed inside or had left by some means other than the door. He said the room contained children's furniture, 2 small beds, the kind made for children between the ages of maybe 4 and 8, a child-sized dresser with small drawers, a rocking horse, painted, the paint faded, but the horse is intact, a small bookshelf holding maybe 2 dozen books, children's books, the spines showing titles that I later identified as being from the early 1900s. The furniture was arranged with the careful organization of a room that was actively used, the beds against opposite walls, the dresser between them, the rocking horse near the window, the bookshelf within reach of either bed. The beds were made. This is the detail that Garrett emphasized, and that I've spent more time thinking about than any other single fact in my 15 years of inspecting houses. The beds were made with sheets and quilts and pillows, the linens tucked and smoothed with the particular neatness that suggests an adult's hand, a mother or a grandmother making beds for children who would unmake them by morning. The quilts were handmade, the patterns consistent with early 20th century Appalachian quilting traditions. The fabric was faded but intact. The room was clean, not dusty but presentable clean, the way a room gets when it's been closed for a while, and the air has been still. Clean. The surfaces of the dresser, the bookshelf, and the windowsill showed no dust accumulation. The floor, which was the same wide plank hardwood as the rest of the second floor, was free of the grit and debris that settles in any room over time, even a sealed one. A room that had been locked for 40 years or more should have had decades of accumulated dust, cobwebs in every corner, and the particular gray film that settles on surfaces in unventilated spaces. This room had none of that. It looked, Garrett said, like someone had cleaned it recently, like someone was maintaining it. The air smelled like children. Garrett said this last, and he said it quietly, and I could tell from his voice that this was the detail that had prompted him to call me. The room smelled like soap and clean cotton, and the warm, particular scent of small sleeping bodies. The smell that any parent recognizes from leaning over a sleeping child's bed, the biological warmth of young skin and clean hair, and the faintly sweet breath of children in deep sleep. The room smelled inhabited, recently, by children, in a house where no children had lived for decades, in a room that had been locked from the inside for at least 40 years. The pillows showed impressions, both of them, shallow oval depressions in the center of each pillow, the kind of impression that a small head makes over the course of a night's sleep, pressed into the filling by the weight of a skull and the hours of stillness. The sheets on both beds were pulled back on one side, folded down at an angle. The way sheets look when someone has gotten out of bed in the morning and hasn't made the bed yet, the covers drawn back just enough to allow a small body to slip out. 2 children had been sleeping in that room. That's what every physical detail communicated. The impressions in the pillows and the pulled back sheets, and the smell of soap and warm skin, and the cleanliness of the surfaces, and the made beds, and the careful arrangement of a room that was set up for occupancy, and showed every sign of being occupied. I went to the house. I went the day after Garrett called, with his permission and the buyer's permission, and I stood in that room, and I looked at the beds and the pillows and the rocking horse and the shelf of books, and I smelled what Garrett had described, the warm scent of children that was fading now that the door was open, dissipating into the hallway, the sealed atmosphere of the room mixing with the air of the house and losing its character. I checked the room for other exits. One window, painted shut, the paint seal unbroken, the hardware locked from inside. No closet door, no panel, no hatch, no access point to any other space. 4 walls, a floor, a ceiling, a door, a window. The door had been locked from the inside. The window had been sealed from the inside. There was no way out of the room that didn't involve unlocking the door or breaking the window, and neither had been done. Someone had locked themselves in this room, or someone had been locked in this room by a mechanism that could only be operated from inside, which is a contradiction that I cannot resolve. And the room had been maintained, kept clean, the beds made, the surfaces dusted, by someone who was either inside a locked room for 40 years, or who could access the room without using the door or the window. The buyers use it as a guest room now. New furniture, new paint, new curtains. The children's things were donated to a historical society in Asheville. The lock was replaced with a modern knob set that locks from both sides. I've never told them what Garrett told me about the pillows or the smell. They didn't ask, and I didn't volunteer, because some things about a house are better left unexamined, better left in the category of previous history that doesn't affect the current occupants. But sometimes I think about those 2 beds, made by an adult's hands, slept in by children's heads, in a room locked from the inside for 40 years in a house where no children lived. I think about the impressions in the pillows and the sheets pulled back, and the smell of soap and warm skin. And I think about 2 children getting up in the morning, sliding out from under their quilts, their small feet touching the cold hardwood floor, standing in a room that is clean and warm and cared for, a room that someone has maintained for them in a house where they are remembered, even if they are not understood. And I wonder where they go during the day, while the room is empty and the door is locked, and the house stands in its 12 acres at the end of a dirt road. And I wonder where they come from at night, when the pillows receive the weight of small heads, and the sheets are pulled back, and the room fills with the warm scent of sleeping children. And I wonder who makes the beds in the morning after they get up, who tucks the sheet, smooths the quilts, fluffs the pillows, cleans the surfaces, and maintains the room for the next night's use. Who has been doing this for 40 years or more, in a locked room, in an empty house, with the devoted attention of someone who is taking care of children who no longer need physical care but who receive it anyway, every night, in a room that smells like soap and sleep and the particular warmth of small bodies dreaming. Someone is taking care of them. That's what I can't stop thinking about. Not the impossibility of it, but the tenderness. They made beds, the clean room, the careful arrangement of furniture in a space designed for comfort and safety. Whatever is happening in that room is not a haunting. It's a nursery, maintained, across decades, by someone who will not stop tending to children, who will not stop coming home to sleep. And the door was locked from the inside because the caretaker was inside, has always been inside, will always be inside, making the beds and cleaning the room and waiting for nightfall, when the children return and the pillows receive their weight, and the room fills with the smell of life that ended long ago but that continues, warm and clean and cared for, behind a locked door in a house in the mountains, where the living can hear nothing and the dead sleep soundly. I run an estate sale company that operates primarily in the coalfield counties of Southwest Virginia, the string of small towns and hollows that runs along the Kentucky border from Wise County to Lee County. a region that has been losing population for decades as the coal industry has contracted and the young people have left for places with more opportunity and less dust in the air. The work is steady because people are still dying, even in places where fewer people are living, and the possessions of the dead have to go somewhere, and my company is the somewhere. We come into a house after the family has taken what they want, and we catalog everything else, price it, and sell it, either at an on-site sale or through our online auctions. It's intimate work. You handle objects that someone touched every day of their life, the coffee mug they drank from every morning, the chair they sat in every evening, the quilt they pulled over their shoulders when the house got cold. You develop a respect for the accumulation, for the way a life leaves its residue in objects, and you learn to work with the quiet professionalism that the dead deserve, even if they're not there to appreciate it. In November of 2022, I was cataloging the contents of a house in Wise County, near the town of Coburn, that had belonged to a woman named Alma Deal who had died at 93. The house was a two-story frame structure in a hollow off the main road, the kind of house that the coal towns produced in their prosperous years, well-built and spacious by mountain standards, with enough rooms to hold the accumulation of a woman who had lived in the same house for 70 years and had never thrown anything away. Her family, a son in Kingsport and a daughter in Roanoke, wanted everything sold. They'd taken the jewelry and a few pieces of furniture and left the rest to me. The house was full in the way that only houses occupied by elderly people who've lived alone for decades can be full. Every surface covered, every drawer packed, every closet and cabinet and shelf loaded with the objects that a long life gathers. Dishes and linens and tools and books and clothing, and the particular category of items that I call the archaeology of daily life, the mundane objects that accumulate not because they're valued, but because they're never discarded, the rubber bands and bread ties and empty jars and magazines and catalogs that pile up in corners and drawers until they become a geological record of the years. I worked through the house systematically, room by room, the way I always do. The ground floor took 3 days. The second floor took 2. The attic was the last area, accessed through a pull-down staircase in the upstairs hallway, a hot, close space under the roof where the insulation was minimal and the temperature followed the outside air with almost no buffer. The attic contained the usual: Christmas decorations in boxes, old luggage, a sewing machine in a cabinet, clothing and garment bags, mothballed and forgotten, and boxes of photographs. Photographs are common in these houses. Every old house in Appalachia contains them, loose in boxes, mounted in albums, framed on walls, the visual record of families that lived in these mountains for generations. I've handled thousands of old photographs in my career, and I've learned to sort them efficiently, separating the ones with historical or artistic value from the snapshots and duplicates that make up the bulk of any collection. The box I found in Alma Deal's attic was different from the usual. It was a wooden box, maybe 18 inches square and 8 inches deep, well made, with a hinged lid and a simple clasp. Inside, wrapped individually in tissue paper, were photographs, formal portraits, black and white, printed on heavy photographic paper with the rich tonal range of professional studio work. They were beautiful images, technically accomplished, showing subjects posed against plain backgrounds with the careful lighting and composition that characterized professional portrait photography in the 1930s and 1940s. There were 42 of them. Each showed a single subject, seated or standing, dressed in what was clearly their best clothing, the suits and dresses that mountain people wore for church and funerals and formal occasions. The subjects ranged in age from young adults to the elderly, both men and women, and they shared enough facial similarity that I could identify them as members of the same extended family. The Deal family, presumably, or their close relations, posed for portraits over what appeared to be a span of maybe 15 years based on the changing photographic styles. Each photograph had writing on the back, pencil in a neat small hand, noting the subject's name and a date: Thomas Henry Deal, March 1938. Lila Faye Combs Deal, August 1940. William Irvin Deal, January 1943. And so on. 42 photographs, 42 names, 42 dates. I noted the names and dates in my catalog and continued working. It wasn't until that evening, when I was cross-referencing the estate inventory with the family records the attorney had provided, that I noticed the discrepancy. The family records included a genealogical document, a typed family tree that the estate attorney said had been prepared by the family for probate purposes. It listed names, birth dates, death dates, and relationships for 3 generations of the Deal family. I was using it to identify items of potential family significance that the son and daughter might want to reconsider selling. Thomas Henry Deal, born 1889, died February 1938. The photograph on the back said March 1938, 1 month after his documented death. I checked the next one, Lila Faye Combs Deal, born 1895, died June 1940. The photograph was dated August 1940, 2 months after death. William Irvin Deal, born 1901, died November 1942. Photograph dated January 1943, 2 months after death. I went through all 42 photographs. Every single one was dated after the subject's documented date of death. The intervals varied, some were weeks, some were months. One, a photograph of a young woman named Pearl Deal, who had died in childbirth in 1936, was dated 1939, 3 years after her death. But the pattern was consistent and absolute. Not a single photograph was dated during the subject's lifetime. Every portrait in that box was made after the person it depicted had died. I checked the death records more carefully, looking for errors in the genealogical document, misrecorded dates, the kind of clerical mistakes that are common in rural records from that era. I found none. The death dates matched the county records, the cemetery records, and the church records. Thomas Henry Deal died in February 1938 and was buried in the family cemetery on the ridge above the hollow. His photograph, showing a man in a dark suit seated in a chair with his hands folded in his lap, eyes open, expression solemn, was taken in March 1938, a month after the funeral. I looked at the photographs more carefully. The subjects were posed and lit with professional skill, their clothing neat, their hair arranged, their expressions carrying the particular gravity that people brought to formal portraits in that era. They looked alive. They looked like people sitting for photographs, holding still for the long exposures that the equipment of the day required, their eyes focused on the camera with the patient solemnity of mountain people who understood that a portrait was a serious occasion. But there were details that I noticed only on close inspection, details that I might have overlooked if I hadn't known the dates, if I hadn't been looking with the particular attention that the impossible demands. The hands of some subjects were arranged with a stiffness that went beyond the formal posing of the era into something more rigid, more fixed, the fingers positioned rather than resting. The clothing on several subjects showed the particular neatness of garments that had been placed on a body rather than worn by one, lapels lying flat with an evenness that a living body's breathing would disturb. The eyes, in some photographs, had a reflective quality that was subtly different from the eyes of the living subjects in other photographs I'd handled from the same era, a flatness, a stillness, an absence of the slight moisture that living eyes maintain. I didn't pursue it further. I cataloged the photographs, listed them in the estate sale inventory as a collection of vintage family portraits, and they sold as a lot to a dealer in antique photography from Abingdon, who was interested in the quality of the printing and the period styling. I didn't tell her about the dates. I didn't tell her what I suspected about the subjects. I did some research afterward, quietly, on my own time. Portrait photography of the deceased was a documented practice in the Victorian and early Edwardian eras, a tradition called post-mortem photography that was common enough to be considered normal rather than macabre. Families would pose their dead for photographs, sometimes in coffins but often seated in chairs or propped in beds, dressed in their best clothes, eyes sometimes open, sometimes closed, photographed as a memorial, a last image to preserve the likeness of someone who would never be photographed again. But post-mortem photography had largely died out by the 1920s. The photographs in Alma Deal's attic dated from the 1930s and 1940s, decades after the practice had fallen from common use. And these weren't the crude, obviously staged images of early post-mortem photography. These were technically excellent studio portraits, professionally lit, carefully composed, showing subjects who appeared, at first glance, to be living people posing for a photographer. Someone in the Deal family, or someone connected to the family, had been photographing the dead for at least 15 years, posing them in chairs, dressing them in their best clothes, arranging their hands and their hair and their expressions, and capturing their images with a skill that made the dead look alive. And Alma Deal had kept these photographs in a wooden box in her attic for the rest of her long life, wrapped individually in tissue paper, handled with the care of objects that were precious and private, and not meant for anyone else to see. I think about the photographer. Someone had to be behind the camera, someone with technical skill and artistic ability, and the willingness to spend time alone with the dead, posing them, adjusting the light, composing the image, working with the quiet patience that good photography requires. Someone who didn't flinch at handling bodies that had been dead for weeks or months. Someone who treated the work as something between art and duty, a service performed for the family or for the dead themselves, a final portrait to add to the collection that Alma would keep wrapped in tissue in a box in her attic. And I think about the dates, the intervals between death and photograph. Weeks, months, once every 3 years. Where were these people in the interim? Were they preserved somehow, kept in a state that allowed them to be posed and photographed months after burial? Were they exhumed? Were they photographed in the funeral home before burial? And the dates on the backs of the photographs represent something other than the date the image was made. Or is the simplest explanation the most disturbing one? That someone photographed these people on the dates written on the backs of the photographs, weeks and months and years after they had died and been buried, and that the photographs show exactly what they appear to show, which is dead people sitting in chairs in a studio, dressed in their best clothes, eyes open, hands folded, looking for all the world like they're alive. I don't know. I sold the photographs, and I closed the estate, and I moved on to the next house and the next collection of objects left behind by the dead. But sometimes at night, when I'm alone in a house that I'm cataloging, surrounded by the possessions of someone who lived and died and left everything behind, I think about the box in the attic and the 42 portraits and the pencil dates on the backs that said these people were photographed after they'd stopped breathing. And I wonder who's taking the photographs now. Whether the tradition continued, whether someone in these mountains is still doing this work, posing the dead in chairs and adjusting the lighting and pressing the shutter and creating portraits of people who shouldn't be able to sit still for a camera but who do. Somehow, in the quiet of a studio or a back room or a parlor, where the living don't go and the dead sit with their hands folded and their eyes open and their best clothes pressed and their likenesses captured one last time. One more portrait for the box, one more name and date on the back, one more face preserved in silver and paper, and the particular patience of the dead who have all the time in the world to hold still for the camera. My husband David and I bought the house in the summer of 2019 because we'd been looking for a project, a place in the mountains that we could renovate together, a house old enough to have character and cheap enough that the renovation budget wouldn't bankrupt us. We found it in Gilmer County, Georgia, about 10 miles from Ellijay, at the end of a gravel road that climbed through second-growth hardwood forest to a small clearing where the house sat with the patient, slightly exhausted look of a structure that had been standing for over a century and wasn't sure how much longer it would bother. The house was a 2-story frame structure, the kind of mountain farmhouse that was common in North Georgia in the late 1800s, built on a stone foundation that was older than the framing above it, the stones fitted without mortar in the dry stack tradition that the early settlers brought from the British Isles and adapted to the materials available in the southern Appalachians. The house had been renovated multiple times, each generation leaving its mark. The original single-pen cabin expanded into a dog trot and then enclosed, and then expanded again with additions that reflected the changing needs and tastes of the families that occupied it. The result was a house that contradicted itself architecturally. Doorways that didn't align with hallways, floor levels that changed between rooms, windows that opened onto walls that had been built after the windows were installed. The kind of house that old house enthusiasts call charming and that building inspectors call a nightmare. We loved it. The stone foundation was sound, the framing was mostly chestnut and oak, and the price was right. We moved in with plans to renovate room by room over the course of 2 or 3 years, living in the spaces we'd completed while working on the ones we hadn't. The basement was the first area I tackled, because a dry basement is the foundation of any renovation, and this one wasn't dry. The basement was accessed through a door in the kitchen, a narrow plank door that opened onto a staircase descending into the original foundation space. The staircase was stone, the treads cut from the same material as the foundation walls, worn smooth by a century of use, narrow and steep in the way that utilitarian stairs in old houses always are, built for function rather than comfort. 12 steps from the kitchen to the cellar floor. I counted them every time, the way you count steps in a dark staircase, your body memorizing the rhythm so your feet know when to expect the floor. The cellar was small, maybe 8 feet by 12, with a dirt floor and rough stone walls and a ceiling of hand-hewn chestnut beams that supported the kitchen floor above. The space was damp, the stone walls seeping in places, the dirt floor showing the dark stain of moisture that rose from the ground below. Standard root cellar construction, the kind of space that every mountain farmhouse had, was used for storing potatoes and canned goods and anything else that needed the consistent cool temperature that the earth provides. A wooden shelf unit stood against the far wall, the shelves empty, the wood soft with decades of damp. I moved the shelf unit on my 3rd day of work in the cellar. I was planning to install a sump pump in the far corner, which seemed to be the lowest point of the floor, and the shelf was in the way. It was heavy but not anchored, and I dragged it away from the wall, expecting to find damp stone and dirt behind it. I found stairs. The staircase continued. Behind where the shelf had been, in the far corner of the cellar, the stone treads descended further into the ground. The same construction as the stairs from the kitchen, the same width, the same angle, the same rough-cut stone walls closing in on both sides. The stairs went down. I stood at the top of the continuation and looked down. My work light illuminated the first few steps clearly, the stone worn less than the stairs above, suggesting less use, but showing the same construction technique, the same hand of the same builder, who had cut the stairs from kitchen to cellar. The stairs descended at the same angle into darkness that my work light couldn't penetrate. I got my flashlight, the heavy-duty LED that I used for inspection work, and I started down. The air temperature dropped with each step, noticeably, measurably, the damp cool of the cellar giving way to a deeper cold that felt less like underground temperature and more like refrigeration, a chill that went into my clothes and my skin and settled against my bones. I counted steps, 14. 14 more treads below the cellar floor, each one the same dimensions as the 12 above, cut from the same stone, set into the same walls, descending at the same angle. At the bottom of the 14th step, the staircase reached a landing, a flat area, maybe 4 feet square, where the stairs turned 90 degrees to the left and continued down. I stood on the landing and pointed my flashlight down the next flight and saw more steps, disappearing into darkness at the same angle, the stone walls continuing, the construction consistent, the stairs going down with the steady determination of a structure that was built to reach something and hadn't reached it yet. The air on the landing was cold, not cellar cold, not underground cold, but a different kind of cold, a cold that had a quality of movement to it, a steady exhalation rising from the depths below the landing, flowing up the staircase, the way warm air flows up a chimney, except this was cold air flowing upward, which meant the space below was colder still, cold enough to generate its own convection, cold enough to push air up a staircase and into a cellar and through a kitchen door if the door were left open. And with the cold came a sound, low at the threshold of hearing, more felt than heard, a rhythmic pulse that I registered in my chest and my throat rather than my ears. Not mechanical, not the hum of equipment or the vibration of water in pipes, organic. A slow, deep, rhythmic sound that rose from below with the cold air and that had the quality of breathing or of a heartbeat or of something that existed in the space between those two, a vast respiratory or circulatory process happening somewhere below me in a space that the stairs were built to access and that the darkness was protecting from my flashlight and my curiosity. I did not go further. I stood on that landing with my flashlight pointed down the continuing staircase, and I listened to the sound, D, and I felt the cold, D, and I made a decision that was not rational, but that was absolute. Whatever was at the bottom of those stairs was not something I wanted to find. The builder of this house had constructed a staircase that went down further than any residential construction requires, further than any root cellar or storm shelter or storage space, down into the mountain itself, and the space at the bottom was producing cold and sound and a steady upward flow of air that carried both. And I was standing at the boundary between the known world of my house and something else, something deeper, something that existed below the foundation of a house that had been standing for over a century. I went back upstairs. I closed the kitchen door and sat at the table and drank coffee until my hand stopped shaking, and then I told David. He went down. He's braver than I am in certain ways, more physical, more inclined to confront a thing directly rather than retreat from it and think about it. He took the flashlight and went down the 12 steps to the cellar and the 14 steps to the landing, and he stood there for maybe 2 minutes, and then he came back and his face was the color of the stone walls. And he said, "We're sealing it." He didn't describe what he'd felt. He didn't describe the sound or the cold or whatever he'd seen when he pointed the flashlight down the continuing staircase. He said, "We're sealing it," and the next day he bought bags of concrete mix and rebar, and he built a form at the top of the continuation, where the cellar floor met the first descending step, and he poured concrete until the staircase was filled from that point to 6 inches above the cellar floor level. He used 20 bags, 4,000 pounds of concrete, filling a staircase that went 14 steps down to a landing, and turned and continued into a darkness that neither of us wanted to measure. The concrete cured. The surface was flat and gray and solid, a plug of stone and steel blocking the stairs that went down too far, sealing whatever was below the landing away from the cellar and the kitchen and the house and the lives we were building in it. For a while, it worked. The cellar felt normal. The kitchen floor above it felt normal. The house did what old houses do, settling and creaking and breathing with the gentle mechanical sounds of a structure, adjusting to weather and temperature, the normal vocabulary of wood and stone responding to the world around it. The sound started about 3 months after the pour, not from the cellar, not from the sealed staircase, from below the kitchen floor, from below the cellar, from somewhere beneath 4,000 pounds of concrete and 14 stone steps, and whatever distance separated the landing from the bottom of a staircase, we'd never fully descended. A sound that I felt in the soles of my feet when I stood in the kitchen, a vibration that was too low for hearing, but too persistent for imagination. The same rhythmic pulse I'd felt on the landing. The same slow, deep, organic beat that rose from below like the heartbeat of the mountain itself. David feels it too. He doesn't talk about it. He doesn't acknowledge it when I mention it. But I've seen him stand in the kitchen and go still. The way you go still when you feel something through the floor that shouldn't be there. The way you hold your breath and listen with your body when your ears aren't giving you enough information. The pulse continues. Every night, sometime after midnight, the kitchen floor vibrates with a rhythm that has nothing to do with the house and everything to do with whatever is at the bottom of the stairs we sealed. The concrete holds. The rebar holds. The plug that David poured into the throat of that staircase holds. But the sound comes through. Concrete transmits vibration with almost perfect fidelity, and whatever is producing the pulse below our house is producing it with enough force to travel through 14 steps of stone and 4,000 pounds of cured concrete and a cellar floor and a layer of chestnut beams and a kitchen floor, and the soles of my shoes when I stand at the sink washing dishes at midnight. I've stood in the kitchen in the dark and felt the rhythm in my feet and tried to count the beats. Slow, maybe 6 per minute, the same rate I felt on the landing, the same deep organic pulse that suggested something vast and alive and patient, something that existed below the house in a space that the original builder had known about and had constructed stairs to reach, and that we had sealed without understanding what we were sealing away from or what we were sealing in. The stairs go down further than they should. That's the simplest way to say it. 12 steps to the cellar, 14 to the landing, and then more, continuing into the mountain, going somewhere that the builder of this house knew about, and that we chose not to visit, and that we sealed with concrete and rebar, in the hope that 4,000 pounds of stone would be enough. Some nights, standing in the kitchen, feeling the pulse through the floor, I wonder if the concrete is a barrier or just a delay. I wonder if whatever is at the bottom of those stairs was being accessed for a reason, if the builder cut those steps because the thing below needed tending, needed visiting, needed the periodic attention of someone who would descend into the cold and the dark and the sound and do whatever was required, and then climb back up to the kitchen and close the door and live a normal life above a staircase that reached into the earth further than stairs should go. And I wonder what happens when it's not tended, when the stairs are sealed and the visits stop, and the thing below is left alone in its dark space with its cold air and its slow pulse. I wonder if it comes up, not through the concrete, not through the stairs, but up through the stone and the earth and the mountain itself, the way cold air rises and the way sound travels through solid material, slowly, patiently, finding its way through the gaps between stones and the cracks in foundations and the spaces where the house meets the ground. I feel it in the kitchen floor. Every night, closer to the surface. Every night, the pulse is a little stronger, the vibration a little more defined. David doesn't talk about it. I stand in the kitchen, and I feel the mountain breathing beneath my feet, and the concrete holds. For now. I've been carrying mail in Pendleton County, West Virginia, for 9 years, driving a route that covers about 60 miles of hollow roads and ridgetop lanes, and the particular kind of gravel track that the county stopped maintaining when the last taxpayer on it died or moved away. The route takes me into some of the most remote terrain in the state, hollows where the road is barely wider than the truck, and the trees meet overhead, and the mailboxes sit at the ends of driveways that disappear into the forest like tunnels. You learn a mail route the way you learn anything you do every day for years, not just the addresses and the names, but the character of each property, the particular way the mailbox leans, the condition of the driveway, the curtain that moves when you pull up because someone is watching, the curtain that doesn't move because nobody is home or nobody lives there anymore. You learn which houses are occupied and which are empty, and which are in the particular state between the two that rural Appalachia produces in abundance, the houses where someone technically lives, but where the signs of life are so minimal that you can't be sure until you see the mail accumulating or not accumulating in the box. The house I'm talking about is on a section of my route that follows a hollow road along a creek about 8 miles south of Franklin. The hollow is narrow and deep, the ridges pressing close on both sides, the road running beside the creek through forest that blocks most of the sky, even in winter when the leaves are down. There are maybe a dozen houses along this stretch, most of them occupied, a few abandoned, the usual mix of active residences and empty structures that characterizes any hollow road in the West Virginia highlands. The house sits on the left side of the road, set back maybe 50 yards, partially hidden by a thicket of privet and honeysuckle that has been growing unchecked for years, the kind of aggressive ornamental vegetation that mountain people planted around their houses in the mid-20th century and that, left untended, will swallow a structure completely in a decade. Through the growth, I could see the house, a small frame structure, maybe 3 or 4 rooms, single story, with a covered porch and a chimney on the north end. The siding was clapboard, painted white at some point in the past, now weathered to gray. The tin roof showed rust in patches. The windows were intact, but dark. I'd never delivered mail there. The mailbox had been removed before I started the route, and the driveway was impassable, blocked at the road by a fallen tree that had been down long enough for the branches to rot away and the trunk to settle into the ground. Behind the tree, the driveway was a memory, overgrown to the point where only the slight depression in the terrain indicated that a vehicle path had once existed. I knew the house was empty because everyone on the route did. The woman who lived in the next house down, Mrs. Burdett, had told me the story early in my tenure when I'd asked about the properties on my route the way new carriers do, wanting to understand the landscape. The house had belonged to a man named Oakes, she said, an elderly bachelor who'd lived there alone for decades after his parents died. In 2016, a fire started in the kitchen, the cause undetermined, and destroyed the kitchen and one bedroom before burning itself out. The rest of the structure was damaged but standing. Oakes had not been home when the fire started, or if he had been, he wasn't there when the volunteer fire department arrived, and he was never seen again. The property was in some kind of legal limbo, no clear air, no estate action, the county unwilling to seize it for a tax debt that was smaller than the cost of processing the seizure. So the house sat, half-burned and empty, the privet growing over it, the driveway filling in, the structure slowly settling into the particular state of abandonment that mountain houses achieve when no one is maintaining them and no one is tearing them down. 7 years of driving past that house, 7 years of seeing the same dark windows and the same gray clapboard and the same overgrown driveway through the same thicket of privet. It was a landmark on my route, the way all houses are landmarks, a fixed point that I passed at roughly the same time every day and that I processed without conscious thought, the way you process a familiar sign or a familiar tree, registering its presence without examining it. January of 2023. A Tuesday, cold, the temperature in the low 20s, with a thin overcast that made the hollow road feel darker than usual. I was driving the route at my normal pace, the truck heater running, the radio on low, the mailboxes appearing at their regular intervals. I passed Mrs. Burdett's house, where I left a catalog and 2 envelopes, and continued along the road toward the next delivery point, which was about a quarter-mile further. The Oaks house was between the 2 deliveries, on the left, behind its screen of privet. I glanced at it the way I always glanced at it, a reflexive check that registered the house without examining it, and then I looked again because something was different. Smoke was rising from the chimney. Not a wisp, not a trace, not the kind of faint haze that a chimney sometimes produces from old creosote warming in cold air. A column of white smoke, steady and defined, rising from the chimney into the cold January air, with the unmistakable output of a fire burning in a firebox, a real fire producing real smoke from real fuel. I slowed the truck. I stopped. I sat in the road with the engine idling and looked at the house through the gaps in the privet, and I could see, through the front window, the warm flicker of firelight. Not electric light, not the white or yellow of a bulb, but the orange, shifting glow of flame, casting moving shadows on the interior wall visible through the glass, the particular light that only a fire produces, warm and alive and dancing with the air currents of a room that was being heated by combustion. Someone had built a fire in a house that had been abandoned for 7 years. Someone had entered a structure that was partially burned, and that had an impassable driveway, and that sat behind a wall of overgrown vegetation, and they had started a fire in the chimney, and were sitting inside in the warm glow of it, in a house where nobody had lived since 2016. I considered walking up the driveway. The thought formed and dissolved almost simultaneously, replaced by a feeling that I can only describe as the instinct of someone who has spent 9 years driving these hollow roads and has learned to read the signs that the mountains produce, the subtle indicators that tell you when a situation is normal and when it isn't. The smoke was normal, the firelight was normal. The house, with its dark windows and its gray clapboard and its half-burned kitchen, was not normal, and the combination of normal signs in an abnormal context produced a feeling in my chest that I recognized as the particular warning that my body issues when something is wrong in a way that my conscious mind hasn't yet identified. I drove on. I delivered the rest of the route and went home, and didn't mention it to anyone because I didn't know what to say. A house that's been empty for 7 years had a fire in the chimney. That's not a story. That's a sentence that invites questions I couldn't answer. The next day, Wednesday, I drove the route and passed the house, and the smoke was there again. Same chimney, same column, same firelight in the window. Thursday, the same. Friday, the same. Every day that week, the Oaks house was producing smoke from its chimney and firelight through its windows. The signs of occupancy as clear and consistent as any occupied house on my route. I stopped on Friday and watched for longer, maybe 10 minutes. The smoke rose steadily, the firelight flickered. Through the front window, I could see the glow playing on the walls of the front room. And I could see, or I thought I could see, the shape of furniture in the room. A chair near the fireplace, a table, the ordinary furnishings of a room that was being used. The house looked lived in. From the road, through the privet, the Oaks house looked like a house where someone was home, where a fire had been lit against the January cold, where a person was sitting in a chair by the hearth, doing whatever people do on cold winter evenings in the mountains. I asked Mrs. Burdett on Monday. I pulled up to her mailbox, X, and she was there, as she often was, checking the box when she heard the truck. I asked her if she'd noticed anything at the Oaks place. She looked at me for a moment with an expression that I've seen on the faces of mountain people many times in my 9 years of carrying their mail. The expression of someone deciding how much to say, calculating the balance between honesty and the particular mountain reticence that treats certain subjects as things better left unspoken. She said nobody has lived there since the fire. She said it flatly, without elaboration, and the way she said it was not the way you say something you believe to be true. It was the way you say something you need to be true, a statement that functions as a boundary, a line drawn in a conversation that you are not willing to cross. I asked if she'd seen the smoke. She looked at me again, longer this time, And then she looked away, toward the Oaks house, and her face did something I can't describe precisely, but that communicated more than any words she could have offered. It was the face of a woman who has lived in this hollow for decades, and who has seen the smoke, and who has decided that seeing it and acknowledging it are two different things, and that the second one is optional. She said sometimes houses hold on to things. She said it quietly, almost to herself. Then she took her mail and went inside and closed the door. I still drive that route. Every day, 5 days a week, I pass the Oaks house in its thicket of privet. Some days the chimney is cold, and the windows are dark. Kay in the house looks the way an abandoned house should look, empty and declining, and slowly being absorbed by the vegetation around it. Some days the smoke rises, and the fire flickers, and the house looks warm and occupied and alive. I've never walked up the driveway. I've never pushed through the privet to get a closer look. I've never knocked on the door or called out or done any of the things that a reasonable person might do when they see signs of life in a house that should be empty. The instinct that stopped me on that first Tuesday has not diminished. If anything, it's gotten stronger, refined by repetition into a certainty that what I'm seeing from the road is not meant to be investigated, that the smoke and the firelight are the surface of something that I do not want to see from the inside. Because here's the thing I haven't mentioned. The fire in 2016 destroyed the kitchen and one bedroom. The chimney is on the north end of the house. The kitchen was on the south end. The chimney serves the front room, the room where the firelight flickers, the room that was damaged but not destroyed. But Mrs. Burdett told me, when she first described the fire, that the chimney had been damaged, that the heat had cracked the flue liner, and that the fire department had red-tagged the chimney as unsafe for use. That you couldn't burn a fire in it without risking a chimney fire that would finish what the 2016 fire started. The chimney is cracked. The flue is compromised. You can't safely burn a fire in that firebox. And the smoke rises steady and white from the chimney every week in winter, and the firelight flickers warm and orange through the front window. And whatever is burning in that house is burning in a chimney that can't hold fire, and a room that shouldn't be heated, and a house where nobody has lived since 2016 when a man named Oaks disappeared, and a fire started, and the kitchen burned, and the chimney cracked, and the privet grew over the driveway, and the mailbox was removed, and the world forgot about the house in the hollow. But the fire didn't forget. The fire keeps burning, and the house keeps smoking, and I keep driving past, and I don't stop, and I don't look too closely, and I deliver the mail to the houses where the living live, and I leave the Oaks house to whatever occupies it now, in the warm glow of a fire that burns in a broken chimney, in an empty house where nobody has lived since the fire. Nobody has lived there since the fire, but somebody's home. The house came to us through my wife's family, which is the way houses pass in these mountains, not through real estate transactions, but through inheritance. One generation to the next, the property moving down the family tree, the way water moves down a watershed, following the path of least resistance until it reaches the person who's willing to take it. My wife's aunt, a woman named Marjorie, who'd lived in the house alone for 23 years after her husband died, passed in the spring of 2020, and the house came to us because we were the only ones in the family who wanted it. My wife's cousins had all moved away, to Charlotte and Atlanta, and the other cities that absorb the young people that the mountains can't hold, and none of them wanted a farmhouse in the Cataloochee Valley area of western North Carolina that was 90 years old and needed work, and sat at the end of a road that the county plowed last when it snowed. We wanted it. My wife had spent summers there as a child, and the house lived in her memory as the best place she'd ever been. The farmhouse with the big kitchen and the porch that wrapped around two sides, and the fields that ran down to the creek where she'd caught crawdads with her cousins. I wanted it because I wanted what the house represented, a place with roots, a home that carried the weight of generations, and that would carry ours if we were willing to do the work of maintaining it. We moved in that July. The house was built in the 1920s, a substantial frame structure with thick walls and high ceilings, and the generous proportions that mountain farmhouses of that era were built with, rooms large enough to hold big families, and the furniture that big families accumulated. The construction was excellent, the kind of work that skilled carpenters produced when lumber was cheap, labor was available, and people built houses to last because they expected their grandchildren to live in them. Chestnut framing, oak floors, plaster walls on hand-split lath, a stone foundation that was as solid as the day it was laid. The house needed updating, but not saving, and we threw ourselves into the work with the energy of people who were building a life in a place that meant something. The attic door was in the upstairs hallway, between the two bedrooms that we used as our bedroom and my office. It was a standard pull-down attic access, the kind that's recessed into the ceiling with a folding ladder that extends when you pull the door down. The door was a panel of painted plywood, hinged at one end, held closed by a hook and eye latch that was mounted on the hallway side. Simple hardware, standard installation, the kind of attic access that exists in thousands of houses, and that most people never think about because it does exactly what it's supposed to do, which is stay closed until someone opens it. The first morning I found it open was in August, maybe 3 weeks after we'd moved in. I came upstairs around 7, and then the attic door was hanging down, the ladder fully extended to the hallway floor, the opening above showing the dark space of the attic with cold morning air pouring down through it like water through an open sluice. I assumed the latch had failed, the hook slipping from the eye due to vibration or the natural movement of the house. I folded the ladder up, pushed the door closed, and engaged the latch, pressing the hook firmly into the eye. I checked it with a tug. Solid, secure. The next morning the door was open. Ladder down, cold air flowing, the hallway chilled to a temperature that was noticeably lower than the rooms on either side. I closed it again, checked the latch, tugged it, solid. The next morning open, and the next, and the next. Every morning for 2 weeks, regardless of how carefully I latched the door the night before, I came upstairs to find it hanging open with the ladder extended and the attic breathing its cold air into our hallway. I examined the latch mechanism carefully. The hook was straight, not bent or worn. The eye was firmly mounted in the door frame, no looseness, no wobble. The engagement was positive, the hook seating fully in the eye with no tendency to slip. I tested it repeatedly, pushing and pulling the door, simulating vibration, checking whether any amount of movement could cause the hook to unseat itself. It couldn't. The geometry of the latch was designed to prevent exactly that, the hook entering the eye at an angle that required deliberate lifting to disengage. This was not a hardware failure. I replaced the latch with a heavier model, a gate latch with a spring-loaded arm that required manual operation to open. The first morning after installation, the door was open. The spring-loaded arm was in the release position, lifted clear of its catch, the way it would be if someone had pressed the release with their thumb and pushed the arm up. I installed a barrel bolt, not a latch, not a hook, not a spring mechanism. A solid steel barrel bolt, the kind that slides into a receiver and that requires a deliberate, linear motion to open, a motion that involves gripping the knob and pulling it toward you, overcoming the friction of steel and steel, with a force and a direction that no vibration or settling or thermal expansion could replicate. I slid the bolt home, checked it, and went to bed. In the morning, the bolt was drawn back. The door was open. The ladder was down. The cold air was pouring through the hallway. I put a camera in the hallway, a battery-powered security camera with night vision capability, mounted on the wall opposite the attic door, with a clear view of the door, the latch, and the hallway in both directions. I set it to record continuously from 10 p.m. to 7 a.m. The first night's footage showed 8 hours of a dark hallway in the green-gray palette of infrared night vision. Nothing moved. Nothing changed. The attic door remained closed, the barrel bolt engaged, the hallway still and empty. Until 3 a.m. At 3 a.m. exactly, the barrel bolt moved. Smoothly, steadily, with the deliberate motion of hardware being operated by a hand that knew exactly how much force to apply and in which direction. The bolt slid from its receiver over the course of about 2 seconds, moving from fully engaged to fully withdrawn in a single continuous motion. No hand was visible, no figure, no shadow, no disturbance in the air, no indication that anything physical was touching the bolt. It simply moved, operated by nothing, opened by no one, sliding through its housing with the mechanical precision of a lock being picked by an expert. The door began to descend. The springs that controlled the door's opening allowed it to drop slowly, hinging at its mounted end, the panel swinging down toward the hallway floor. The ladder, attached to the door panel, unfolded as the door descended, section by section, extending to its full length as the door reached its fully open position. The entire process took maybe 15 seconds. Door opening, ladder extending, the attic access transitioning from closed to fully open in the quiet hallway, while the camera recorded every frame and showed no cause for any of it. I watched the footage 3 times. I watched it in real time and in slow motion and frame by frame. The bolt moved, the door opened, the ladder extended. Nothing touched any of it. At 3 a.m., with the precision of an event that occurs on a schedule, the hardware that secured the attic door operated itself, and the door opened, and the ladder unfolded, and the cold, dark space above became accessible from the hallway below. I showed the footage to my wife. She watched it once, and then she asked me a question that I hadn't considered, and that has been sitting in my mind ever since. She asked whether the door was being opened from the hallway side or the attic side. She pointed out that the barrel bolt was on the hallway side, which meant it could only be operated from the hallway. But the door hinged upward into the attic space, which meant that pushing it open from above would also open it. The bolt, she said, was being withdrawn first, which suggested that whatever was opening the door was operating the bolt from the hallway side, from below, from the space where we slept, not from the attic above. Unless the bolt was being withdrawn by something that could operate hardware from either side, unless the distinction between hallway and attic, between below and above, between our space and the space above the ceiling, was a distinction that whatever opened the door recognized or respected. I climbed into the attic the next day, in daylight, with a flashlight and the courage that daylight provides. The attic was standard, unfinished, the rafters visible overhead, old fiberglass insulation between the joists, and a plywood walkway running down the center. Dust, stillness, the particular dead air of a space that has been sealed for years. I walked the full length and found nothing. No objects, no nests, no signs of animal habitation, no evidence that anything living had been up there. Just insulation and dust, and the gray light filtering through the gable vents at either end. But the dust was disturbed. Not everywhere, not randomly, but in a path. A narrow track through the dust on the plywood walkway, running from the attic door to the far end of the attic and back, as if someone had been walking the same route repeatedly, their passage wearing a visible trail through the dust that coated the plywood. The trail was narrow, the width of a single person walking, and it was consistent, the dust equally displaced along its entire length, suggesting not a single passage but many, the same path walked over and over, night after night, a route through the attic that started at the door and ended at the far wall and returned. I don't go in the attic anymore. I don't latch the door anymore either. There's no point. Whatever opens it at 3 a.m. will open it regardless of what I install, and the effort of securing it every night only to find it open every morning was becoming its own kind of madness, the repetitive cycle of locking and unlocking that was consuming more of my mental energy than the open door itself. I leave it open now. Every night, the door hangs down, the ladder extends, and the cold air from the attic flows into the hallway. We close our bedroom door to keep the chill out. We've adjusted. You adjust to anything if you live with it long enough. And we've been living with an attic door that opens at 3 a.m. for over 4 years now. But I think about the dust trail, the path worn through the dust on the plywood walkway, from the door to the far wall and back. Something walks that path every night, descending the ladder at 3 a.m., or ascending it, or both, traversing the length of the attic in the dark for a purpose that I cannot determine, and that the camera cannot capture, and that the house absorbs as part of its nightly routine. And I think about what my wife said, whether the door opens from below or above, whether the thing that walks the dust trail is coming up from the hallway or coming down from the attic, whether the bolt slides back because something in the hallway wants to go up, or because something in the attic wants to come down. At 3 a.m., in the dark, in a house that has been in my wife's family for generations, someone walks, up the ladder or down it, along the attic or from the attic, through the door that opens by itself at the same time every night, with the punctuality of an appointment being kept. I don't know who. I don't know why. I don't know where they go or what they do in the dark space above our ceiling, where the dust holds the record of their passage and the cold air carries whatever they bring with them when they walk. I just know the door opens at 3, every night, without fail, without cause. And in the morning, the hallway is cold, and the ladder is down, and the dust in the attic has been walked again, and whatever appointment was kept at 3 a.m. has been kept, and the house is quiet, and the day begins, and we live our lives above whatever lives above us, separated by a ceiling and a door that won't stay closed, and the particular faith of people who have decided that some questions are better left unanswered in houses that are older than the answers would be. My great-uncle Virgil died in October of 2021 at the age of 87, alone in the house where he'd lived for 50 years, in a hollow outside Irwin, Tennessee, that was remote enough that nobody found him for 4 days. I'd met him twice in my life, both times at family funerals, and my memory of him was vague, a tall, thin man who stood at the edges of gatherings and spoke only when directly addressed, and who carried himself with the particular stillness of someone who had spent so much time alone that the presence of other people required conscious effort. He'd never married. He'd never had children. He'd worked for the railroad, and then he'd retire. And he'd lived in that house in that hollow for the remaining decades of his life, doing whatever solitary men do in the mountains of East Tennessee when the world has stopped requiring their participation. He died without a will, which meant the property passed to his nearest living relative through intestate succession, and after the genealogical dust settled, that relative was me. My mother had been his niece, the daughter of his brother, and with both of them dead, I was the closest surviving connection to a man I barely knew and a house I'd never visited. I drove down from Knoxville on a Saturday in November to see what I'd inherited. The house was at the end of a gravel road that followed a creek up a narrow hollow, the kind of road that's maintained just enough to be passable and not enough to be comfortable. The house was a modest frame structure, single story, 3 or 4 rooms, sitting in a small clearing with a barn behind it and a garden space that hadn't been tended in years. The construction was unremarkable, the kind of functional mountain house that was built by the thousands in the early 20th century, clapboard siding, tin roof, simple floor plan. Inside, the house was clean and sparse, the belongings of a man who didn't accumulate: a few pieces of furniture, a kitchen with minimal equipment, a bedroom with a bed and a dresser, the fundamental necessities of domestic life, and nothing more. The mirror was in the hallway. The downstairs hallway was the central corridor of the house, running from the front door to the kitchen at the back, maybe 12 feet long and 4 feet wide, with doors opening off it to the bedroom on one side and the living room on the other. Mounted on the wall at the far end of the hallway, opposite the front door, was a mirror. It was large, maybe 4 feet wide and 6 feet tall, in a wooden frame that looked handmade, the wood dark and smooth with age, carved with a simple border pattern that suggested skilled, but not professional craftsmanship. The glass was old, showing the slight waviness and the subtle silvering deterioration that antique mirrors develop as the reflective backing breaks down over decades. It was mounted directly to the wall with heavy screws, positioned so that it was the first thing you saw when you opened the front door. The hallway reflected at you with yourself standing in it. I planned to sell it. An antique mirror in a handmade frame had enough value to be worth listing, and I was going to sell or donate most of the house's contents regardless. I made a mental note and continued my assessment of the property. I came back the following weekend to begin clearing the house. I started in the kitchen, which was the most straightforward room, boxing up dishes and cookware and the minimal pantry supplies that Virgil had left behind. By late afternoon, I'd moved to the hallway, where I was sorting coats and shoes from the closet near the front door. I was standing in the hallway with my back to the mirror, facing the front door, when I glanced over my shoulder at the reflection. The hallway was reflected accurately. The front door behind me, the coat rack on the left wall, the overhead light fixture, the floor runner that was worn thin from 50 years of Virgil's feet. Everything correct, everything in its place, every detail matching the physical reality of the hallway I was standing in, except that the hallway was longer. In the reflection, the hallway behind me didn't end at the front door. It continued. The front door was there, in its correct position, but beyond it, the hallway extended, additional space receding into the mirror's depth, as if the house contained more hallway than it actually did. A corridor that went past the front door and continued for what appeared to be another 10 or 15 feet before ending in a darkness that the mirror's light couldn't reach. I turned around and looked at the actual hallway. It ended at the front door, 12 feet from the mirror to the door. The door was closed. The hallway stopped. There was no additional space beyond it, because beyond it was the front porch, the yard, and the world outside. I turned back to the mirror. The reflection showed the hallway ending at the door. 12 feet, normal, accurate. Whatever I'd seen, the extension, the additional depth, was gone. The mirror was showing me exactly what was behind me, no more, no less. I stood there for a minute, watching the reflection, and then I went back to work and told myself it was a trick of the old glass, the waviness and the silvering deterioration, creating a distortion that my brain had interpreted as depth. Old mirrors do strange things with light. The imperfections in the glass bend and stretch the image in ways that can suggest spaces that don't exist. This was a rational explanation, and I believed it. The second time was the following day. I was in the hallway again, and I caught the extension in my peripheral vision, a flash of additional depth in the mirror that vanished when I looked at it directly. The third time was an hour later, and this time I held my gaze on the mirror without turning, and I saw it clearly. The hallway extending beyond the front door into space that the house didn't contain, the walls and floor and ceiling of the corridor, continuing with perfect consistency into a depth that shouldn't have been there. I started watching the mirror deliberately, not constantly, not obsessively, but with the focused attention of someone who needs to understand what they're seeing. Over the next 2 weekends of clearing the house, I observed the extension maybe a dozen times. It wasn't constant. The mirror showed the normal hallway most of the time, a faithful reflection of 12 feet of corridor ending at the front door. But intermittently, without pattern or warning, the reflection would show the longer hallway, the additional space extending beyond the door into whatever the mirror was accessing when it stopped reflecting what was actually there. The 6th or 7th time I saw it, I noticed the figure. It was at the far end of the extended hallway, at the limit of what the mirror could show, standing in the darkness where the additional corridor ended or where the light failed. A shape, not clear, not detailed, not distinct enough to describe as a person or as anything else specific. Just a shape, vertical, approximately the height and width of a human being, standing motionless at the extreme range of the reflection, occupying a space that existed only in the mirror, in a hallway that extended into a version of the house that was larger than the house I was standing in. I watched the figure for maybe 30 seconds before the extension collapsed, and the mirror returned to showing the normal hallway and the front and nothing beyond. The figure didn't move during those 30 seconds. It didn't approach, didn't gesture, didn't do anything that I could interpret as action or intention. It stood, at a distance, at the end of a hallway that shouldn't have existed, and it was there. I saw it 4 more times over the following weeks. Always in the same position, at the far end of the extended hallway, always motionless, always at the limit of visibility. The figure never changed position, never came closer, never became more distinct. It was a fixed presence in a space that appeared and disappeared, according to whatever schedule the mirror operated on, a shape standing in a hallway that the mirror showed me only when it chose to. I removed the mirror in December. I unscrewed the mounting hardware, lifted it from the wall, carried it to the barn, and leaned it against the wall, face inward. The wall behind where the mirror had hung was normal plaster, painted white, showing the rectangular outline where the mirror had protected the surface from years of fading and aging. The plaster was slightly brighter within the rectangle, and the paint was preserved. The hallway felt different immediately. Not just visually different, though the absence of the mirror changed the light and the sense of space. The hallway felt shorter. Not measured shorter, not physically compressed, but perceptually reduced, as if the removal of the mirror had taken something with it. Not just the reflection, but the depth, the possibility of extension, the additional space that the mirror had sometimes shown. I closed up the house. I haven't decided what to do with the property. I drive down occasionally to check on it, to make sure the roof is holding and the pipes haven't frozen, and the structure is intact. Each time I walk the hallway, I look at the blank wall where the mirror hung, and I see the rectangular outline in the plaster, the preserved paint within the shape of the frame, the wall remembering what used to hang there. And some mornings, when the light through the front door hits that blank wall at a certain angle, the outline looks less like a paint difference and more like a window. A rectangular space in the wall that is slightly different from the wall around it, slightly more present, slightly more dimensional, as if the wall where the mirror hung has retained something of the mirror's properties. The ability to show what's behind you, the capacity for depth that extends beyond what the house contains. I don't stand with my back to that wall. When I walk the hallway, I face the blank space, and I walk toward it, and I look at it directly, and it's just plaster, Just paint, just the faded outline of a frame that hung there for 50 years. But I don't turn my back on it, because the mirror is in the barn, face to the wall, and the wall where it hung is blank and normal, and the hallway is 12 feet long and ends at the front door, the way it should. And I don't know if the figure is still standing at the end of a hallway that doesn't exist, in a mirror that's no longer reflecting anything but the inside of a barn wall. I don't know if the extended hallway is still there, in the glass, in the dark, whether the mirror is showing its longer version of the house to nobody, reflecting a corridor that recedes into a depth that no one is looking at, or whether the figure is closer now, whether, without anyone watching, without the check of a human eye to hold it at the far end of the hallway, it has been moving, frame by frame, the way things move when no one is looking, closing the distance between the far end of the impossible hallway and the surface of the glass. The mirror is in the barn, face the wall, and I leave it there. And I don't look, because looking is what kept it at the far end. Looking is what held the distance. And if I look now, if I walk into the barn and turn the mirror around and see my reflection in the hallway that extends beyond what the house contains, I'm afraid of what I'll see, not at the far end of the corridor, right behind me. We found the house on one of those vacation rental websites, the kind that lists everything from modern condos to converted barns. And it caught my wife's eye because of the photographs, which showed a farmhouse in the mountains of western North Carolina that looked like it had been lifted from a postcard and set down in a clearing surrounded by autumn color, exposed ceiling beams, a stone fireplace that took up most of one wall, wide plank floors that showed the wear of a century of feet, a covered porch with rocking chairs that faced a meadow dropping away to a tree line of maples and oaks that the listing promised would be in full color by mid-October. The listing described it as a lovingly restored 1900s farmhouse, and the photographs supported the claim, showing a house that had been updated with modern plumbing and electricity while retaining the character of the original construction, the bones of the old house visible and celebrated beneath the careful renovation. We booked it for the third week of October, a full 7 days, which was more than we usually took for a vacation, but which felt justified by the cost of the drive from our home in Raleigh and the desire to actually settle into a place rather than just passing through it. My wife Ellen and I and our 2 kids, Jack, who was 11, and Sophie, who was 8, loaded the car on a Saturday morning and drove west through the Piedmont and into the mountains, arriving at the property in the late afternoon when the light was golden and the house looked exactly like the photographs and the kids were out of the car before I'd turned off the engine, running toward the meadow with the uncontained energy of children released from a long drive into a space that was built for running. The house was everything the listing promised. The interior was warm and welcoming, the stone fireplace drawing properly when I lit a fire that first evening, the kitchen equipped with everything we needed to cook the meals that Ellen had planned, the bedrooms comfortable, the plank floors creaking under our feet with the pleasant, musical sound of old wood accepting new weight. The house felt good. That's a vague description, but it's the most accurate one I can offer. Some houses feel neutral, spaces that shelter you without engaging you. Some feel hostile, structures that resist habitation, that seem to push back against the presence of people with a coldness that goes beyond temperature. This house felt welcoming. It felt like a house that wanted people in it, that responded to the noise and the warmth and the activity of a family with a kind of settling contentment, the way a dog settles when its owner comes home. We had a wonderful week. I need to say this clearly, because what happened on the last morning tends to overshadow everything that came before, and I don't want that. The week was genuinely beautiful. The kids explored the property, finding a creek at the bottom of the meadow where they spent hours building dams and catching salamanders. Ellen and I hiked trails in the nearby national forest, coming back to the farmhouse each evening to cook dinner in the big kitchen, sit by the fire, play board games with the kids, and feel the particular contentment that comes from being temporarily freed from the schedules and obligations that structure ordinary life. The house held us well. It was warm when we needed warmth and quiet when we needed quiet, and spacious enough that 4 people could coexist without friction. By midweek, it felt less like a rental and more like a home, the kind of place that you start imagining yourself living in, the kind of place that makes you reconsider the choices that put you in a subdivision in Raleigh instead of a farmhouse in the mountains. The last morning was a Saturday. We'd packed most of our things the night before, knowing that the checkout time was 11 and that the drive home would take 4 hours and that the kids would need the structure of a defined departure to prevent the whining that accompanies the end of any vacation. I woke early, around 6, and came downstairs to make coffee and start loading the car. The house was quiet. The fire had burned down to ash overnight, the living room cool, the morning light coming through the east-facing windows in long shafts that caught the dust motes drifting in the still air. I started coffee and went out to the car to begin loading bags. And when I came back inside, the kitchen door had closed behind me. Not slammed, not blown by wind. The door had been propped open with a doorstop, a heavy iron wedge that I'd placed there the first day to keep the door from swinging shut while we carried things in and out. The doorstop was still in position. The door had closed against it, pushing past the resistance of the wedge, settling into its frame with the quiet authority of a door that wanted to be closed. I opened it again and wedged it with the doorstop and went back to the car. When I returned, the door was closed. Same wedge, same position, same door that had decided, twice now, that it should be shut rather than open. I left it closed and went through the front door instead. Ellen came down around 7 with the kids, and we had breakfast and began the final packing. As we moved through the house, collecting the last of our things, checking drawers and closets, the sounds began. The floorboards in the hallway creaked. Not the random creaking of old wood responding to temperature change, but a sequential pattern, one board after another, moving from the back of the house toward the front, the sound of someone walking the hallway with a measured, unhurried pace. I was standing at the front door when I heard it, and I could track the sound as it moved toward me, board by board, step by step, the progression clear and deliberate. I looked down the hallway, empty. The creaking continued past me, moving into the living room, pausing, then moving to the kitchen, pausing again, as if whoever was walking was checking each room, surveying the spaces we were emptying, taking inventory of what was being removed. The doors began closing. The bedroom doors, which we'd left open to air out the rooms as we packed, swung shut one by one, slowly, with the gentle pressure of a hand rather than the force of a draft. The bathroom door closed. The closet door and the master bedroom closed, each one moving slowly, deliberately, settling into its frame with a soft click of the latch engaging. The fireplace exhaled, a single breath of warm air that pushed from the firebox into the living room, carrying the smell of wood smoke, the scent of fires we'd burned during the week, oak and maple, and the particular sweetness of applewood that I'd found in the woodpile and that had made the living room smell like autumn every evening. The exhale was warm, brief, and unmistakable, the firebox pushing air into the room from a fire that had been dead since midnight. Ellen was in the kitchen when the rocking chair started. I heard her say, "Come look," her voice carrying an odd quality that was not alarm but something adjacent to it, and I walked onto the front porch and saw the rocking chair moving. The chair on the left, the one Ellen had claimed as hers for the week, the one she'd sat in every evening watching the meadow and the mountains beyond, was rocking. Slowly, with the measured cadence of someone sitting in it and pushing gently with their feet, forward and back, the wooden runners creaked on the porch boards with the particular sound that rocking chairs make when they're occupied. But the chair was empty. Ellen said the house doesn't want us to leave. She said it with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes, the way people deliver observations that they want to be jokes, but that feel too accurate for humor. I didn't laugh. She didn't laugh. The rocking chair continued its slow motion, and the doors inside continued to close, and the floorboards continued their measured patrol through the rooms, and we loaded the car with an efficiency that had nothing to do with the checkout, time, and everything to do with the growing feeling that we were witnessing something private, something that the house did when it was losing its people, a response to departure that we were not meant to see but that the house couldn't contain. We finished loading. I did a final walkthrough, checking every room, every closet, every drawer. The house was empty of our things. The beds were stripped, the kitchen was clean, the fire was cold, and every door was closed. Every single door in the house, interior and exterior, was shut, the latches engaged, the rooms sealed, as if the house were compartmentalizing itself, closing off the spaces one by one, returning each room to the empty state that preceded our arrival. I stood in the living room for a moment, in the quiet. The footstep sounds had stopped. The doors had finished closing. The house was still, the particular stillness of a structure that is inhabited by no one, the baseline silence of a building holding nothing but air and furniture, and the memory of the people who just left. I walked out the front door. Dee pulled it closed behind me. Ian went to the car where Ellen and the kids were waiting. I started the engine, backed down the driveway, turned onto the gravel road, and glanced in the rearview mirror. The rocking chair was still moving. From 50 yards, I could see it on the porch, rocking with the same measured cadence, forward and back, keeping the rhythm of an occupant who wasn't there. And the front door, which I had closed, which I had pulled shut with my own hand, and heard the latch engage, was opening. Slowly, moving inward, swinging into the hallway of the house with the unhurried patience of a door being opened by someone standing inside, someone welcoming someone else or saying goodbye, the door swinging wide until the hallway was visible from the road, empty and dark and waiting. And then it closed. Gently, fully, the latch clicked with a sound I couldn't hear from the car, but that I knew, the sound the door had been making all morning, the sound of a house sealing itself, settling back, returning to the long patience that was its natural state. We drove home. The kids fell asleep before we reached the highway. Ellen was quiet for a long time, looking out the window at the mountains going past. Eventually, she said we should go back next year. And I said yes, and I meant it, because the house wasn't threatening us. The closing doors and the creaking floors and the rocking chair and the warm exhale from the fireplace, none of it was hostile. None of it was frightening in the way that a haunting is frightening. It was something else. It was the behavior of a house that had been built by people who lived in it and died in it, and who had left something of themselves in the structure, in the beams and the stone and the wide plank floors, something that activated when the house was full and that grieved, gently, privately, when the house was emptied again. The house doesn't want us to leave. Ellen said it was a joke, but the house confirmed it with every door it closed and every board it creaked and every slow rotation of the rocking chair on the porch. It doesn't want us to leave. And next October, when we drive up the gravel road and park in the clearing and open the front door, that I know will be unlocked and waiting, I think the house will be glad. I think the rocking chair will still be rocking when we arrive, and the doors will be open. The fireplace will be cold, and the hallway will be quiet. And then we'll walk in, and the house will start again. The warmth and the sounds and the creaking of the floors, and for one more week the rooms will be full, and the fire will burn, and the rocking chair will rock, and the house will do what houses are meant to do, which is hold the living and remember the dead and wait, with the long patience of stone and wood, and the particular love that old houses develop for the people who fill them. We're going back. We booked it for October, and I think the house knows, and I think it's waiting, the way it always waits, patiently, hopefully, with the door unlocked and the rocking chair still, and the hallway leading into rooms that want nothing more than the sound of footsteps and the warmth of bodies and the brief, precious interruption of the silence that a family provides.